I'm not sure I want to put you in the mood. I'd rather explain to you what the mood is rather than be responsible for what you will feel when I finish, because that's not completely my responsibility. But let me focus, as you said, on the Middle East. I mean, I think it comes very naturally into the first presentation. But in terms of the Middle East, and building on the point you made in the first introduction, how can we help? What can we do to move on? Frankly, to do that, I think it's important to address at least three questions. First of all, why did what happened happen? Why did we have the Arab awakenings or the Arab revolutions or whatever you want to call them? Why did they happen? What do we have now? And thirdly, where do we go from where we are? In the disciplines, there is a difference between economics and politics, but in real life, they're interlinked. So I'm going to focus on the politics of it with a slight reference to economics. But again, we can't move forward politically if we don't have a reasonable and efficient development agenda. And I also think the opposite is also true. So that's obvious. Really. First thing is, why revolutions rather than evolution? Why did we do it the way we did rather than do it gradually? And I basically, in taking a step back and thinking about this, come up with 4 or 5 reasons for that in the Middle East in particular. And when I say the Middle East, my bias really in terms of my interest is the Arab world. So most of my references will be relevant to the Arab world experience, although it may also a little bit touch on Iran, Turkey, and Israel also. But again, my facts are based on the Arab world. First thing is the breakdown of the social contract between those governing and those being governed. And I don't mean this only governments. I mean governments, private sector, anybody who has authority, and anybody who is working within the context of that authority. And the reflection of that is that what were 2 of the 3 most loudly called for demands by the revolutionaries: freedom and social justice. Basically means they don't feel that they're being treated fairly, and they want to have a different environment in which to develop their own well-being. So I really believe that that was the first issue that led to why we're moving towards change and the awakening. Doesn't necessarily define why we went to revolution, but it is, with the others, good reason to do that. The other reason is, if you look at the demographics in the region, at least 35% of the population is younger than 30 years old. That kind of generation anywhere in the world, even in the best of circumstances, wants change and wants it quickly. And if you add that to an environment that is tense, where people are not satisfied and the pressures for change are immediate, that's an added catalyst. The third element is technology. And I don't mean technology only by internet and the satellite dishes and so on and so forth, but I basically mean technology in the sense that anybody walking the street today competes with the source of information and the transmitter of the information, who was originally the governments in the past, in authority. He has the same kind of authority as the government and can actually use it much more quickly because he's not responsible for what he conveys on the equipment that he's using. So, in essence, the layman gained a little bit of power of authority, and the governments or people of authority lost a little bit of that at the same time. And that changed the authority balance in the region. And fourth or fifth, the longevity, the extreme longevity of Arab leaders. And the reason I say this, I'll mention 2 things. First of all, if you look at Tunis, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen, the minimum tenure of the presidents who left was 30 years, and the maximum went beyond 40. So you're looking at 30 or 40 years in office in the same place. How do you really expect to want to change to have vision towards the future. You may have the wisdom of experience, but to be able to deal with new realities. I mean, I think most of you here are of a mature age, so you personally feel it's much more difficult to sort of add new habits when you get older. So if you add these four factors, that on the one hand, there's a breakdown in the bargain. Secondly, people are very young, they're very impatient, they are empowered, and you have leaders who, with all of their successes in certain periods of their reign, are unable to really look at the future and meet the demands of a different demographic, and to do that in a rapid fashion with new technology. Together, these factors for me constitute what I call a managing change deficiency. I really believe that in the Arab world, it's a problem of managing change. And I'm not going to get into the cultural and traditional reasons for this, but if you look at just these four factors, they are significant enough to explain why we went from where we were to where we are now through a revolution rather than through evolution. But it hasn't really been that simple either. The managing change deficiency is our domestic problem. If you add to it other problems that have a regional or foreign policy component, then you come up with another deficit, frankly. And again, I'm talking about my own countries in the Arab world. I can speak there freely. And I actually also believe there's a national security deficit as well, because most of the Arab countries have for generations, almost without exception, been overly dependent on foreign powers, be that in terms of concrete security arrangements, or be that in terms of where they buy the military hardware, or frankly, even where they decide to put most of their investments, or which countries they decide to trade the most with. When you do that, you develop two trends. One is you become overly dependent and then complacent in developing your own capacities. Therefore, in comparison to other regional players, you end up being on the lower side of the bargain. And that's why you see a much more prominent role for Iran, Turkey, and Israel politically, not only militarily, but politically, than you have in the past, especially over the last 5 years. But it's also a reason for the involvement of every possible international player into the Arab awakening process, which would not have been the case had it been simply a domestic process in one country or the other. And again, if you look at the Arab world in one form or the other, almost every single Arab country has done this overdependence, and some of them has sort of flipped from one country to the other over the years. These are general points, but it's important also to take into account that there are common elements, but there are differences between what happened in Tunis, in Egypt, Libya, Yemen, and what's happening in Syria, and as well as in Iraq. I would argue that Tunis and Egypt were essentially homegrown frustrations and will ultimately be essentially resolved by homegrown solutions. There will always be a foreign component. And frankly, some of the economic problems in particular are so strong, without international support, we're going to have tremendous difficulty. But these were mostly homegrown. They weren't about foreign policy, per se. Libya, which is a failed state with very serious ramifications on both Tunis and Egypt, as well as Algeria and others, was also homegrown and was a function, frankly, of Gaddafi's efficiency in destroying all government institutions over his 40-year tenure in office. There was nobody to manage the disorder or to take on the charge after the revolutions or the awakenings happened there. Syria and Yemen, similarly, started off homegrown, but then immediately jumped into regional geopolitics and then international geopolitics for Syria in particular. And As you move towards the Levant, as you brought in the international factors, where you had domestic breakdowns, regional geopolitics, international involvement, it really became an open playing field, and you saw a much more significant emergence of non-state parties, not specifically extremists and terrorists, ISIS and Nusra, and there are so many, frankly, I can't name them all. And they extend over a number of borders. They're not only in Syria or in Iraq, but that's where the focus is. The point, again, to take into account here, if we were to look at the situation in Syria, even stabilizing Iraq, there's almost no way you can get a solution in Syria without the Americans and the Russians agreeing, without the Turks having a different policy, without the Saudis and the Iranians agreeing, and all of these, frankly, are almost impossible to achieve in the short term. And I haven't even mentioned what I should have mentioned at the top of that list, the Syrians agreeing. So what you have here is not only a Syrian domestic problem, but a geopolitical problem that's much more complicated, and where everybody is trying to take advantage of the Syrians in pushing their national interest one way or the other. Where are we? Now, I think is important to sort of think about before moving to where we should move forward. First of all, everybody I talk to seems to be frustrated. Some are frustrated because they want the past to reincarnate itself identically as it was previously, and I don't think it's going to happen. Others are frustrated because reform has been delayed, and their dreams were much more progressive than what we've achieved so far. I personally think that in the next 3 or 4 years, you're going to see more good and more bad. Things, as I think in your slide earlier, it's not going to be solved in 3 or 4 years. It'll probably take more than the 12, 15 years to come to resolution because of the different elements that I've mentioned. But I honestly believe, long term, probably at much larger cost than I would have liked, but long term, I think this dissemination of authority, the empowerment of the people slowly by information, by technology, is forcing a debate and a dialogue. If you look at what's happening in the media in the Arab world, including in Egypt, even in the parliament, with all the mistakes that we're watching, people in their own way, occasionally in a very sophisticated fashion, more often crudely, are challenging authority, are raising issues. It's going to take a long time. But I'm not ready to say that the awakenings are dead or are over, and I'm not ready to say that there's been a success. There's still a long way to get to that point. Again, as I mentioned, Tunis and Egypt, for me, will be resolved with a domestic balance, when and where we get it in place. We will be affected, and there will be pushback caused by security concerns. And that's a legitimate security concern. There is a serious problem of security, extremism, and violence. People can accuse the authorities of exaggerating here and there. All that aside, there is a serious security problem, and that will cause authority to retrench occasionally, to slow down occasionally. But it's something we need to take into account. Global geopolitics. I think it's important for Arab countries to start looking at its own region at the same time as it's looking towards its own country inwards. We don't have the luxury of time to push regional politics to a later stage, or we will be faced with a region which is completely different from what it was when we started. The economic reconstruction issues and Yemen. At the end of the day, many people like you or like myself can talk about principles and reforms and all of that, but the average layman wants to be able to have his basic needs, a higher standard of living, as well as the issue of freedoms. So I think economic reconstruction, economic development is going to be a major factor in all of these issues, all of these areas. If I can just put on the slide on Syria, just to give you an example of the magnitude of economic loss that has occurred in Syria in particular. And these figures come from an ESCWA report and other UN documents. I mean, the estimate is that if the war in Syria was to continue for 3 to 4 more years, we would have lost over $1.3 trillion in economic interests. Even today, there are almost very close to 500,000 people who have been killed, and an extremely large number of those who will have disabilities that will stay with them for a long period of their life. The estimated physical loss in Syria is well over $250 billion alone. Now, in terms of the development issues, if we look at the next slide, the next slide here shows how the capital loss is distributed in different sectors of the economy. Agriculture is relatively small at 7%. Building and construction, you could expect, in a war zone is 30%. Industry is 18%. That's 18% of the loss. And then you have the other elements: finance, transport, internal trade, and utilities. But next slide, please. The question really is, okay, what do we do if we are to put together an economic plan to deal with the Syrian case? It would be nice to try to simply cross out everything and start from zero, but you can't do that in real life. So I think the ESCWA came up with a very reasonable approach that you need to have 2 different phases: a peace building phase, what do you do economically in the peace building phase, and secondly, what do you do in the state building phase? In other words, what do you do immediately, and what would you do once you get things started? And in this next slide, you will see again the distribution of where they would like to see the growth in the first phase. Most of these sectors tend to be sectors that will have a direct effect quickly on the average Syrian if there's peace, or in sectors which would, for example, transportation, which you have to build up in order to build the economy as you move forward. So again, here you see building and reconstruction is at 12%, electricity and water at 7.7%, agriculture is at 12.9%, and the others are there up in the chart quite clearly. The second phase, which is the state building phase, has slightly different percentages in the distribution here, but again, it shows where the focus and the priority should be in that phase after providing the average layman with assistance and some hope towards the future. Let me close quickly with a couple of comments on the regional implications of where we are and what we need to do. And when I say we, I mean mostly the Arab world, although there is a regional component as well. What we've seen so far in the region has been so traumatic that one of the infamous agreements post-World War I, Sykes-Picot, has become something we all want to keep. In other words, the boundaries developed by Sykes and Picot, which we always challenged historically, are something that we're too scared to change. And frankly, I agree with it. It is simply not the time, and it's much too costly to try to re-navigate history and re-navigate borders, especially in today's environment. But the question here comes that the trauma is so severe that it's not really about borders. It's about who we are. Because in the Levant in particular, you find, for example, Kurds in 3 or 4 different countries. You find Shia and Sunnis living in different countries. Now, if you decide to define them based on their ethnicity, on their religion, on their beliefs, then you redefine the borders completely and you change the nation-state system throughout that region. So you're really be looking for chaos even in a stable environment and a catastrophe in today's environment. So that kind of approach will have a very serious implications on the stability of the region. But we can't ignore the fact that the problem now exists. There's a strong trend now to try to look for solutions based on federalism in particular. And while I don't have a problem with federalism, I do have a problem if federalism is meant to be defined on the basis of ethnicity and dividing the nation-state system, while if it was a situation, and you'll find this a bit amusing, the case of Switzerland, for example. Switzerland is a federal state, and it was originally developed based on differences on religion. But they have the assurances, the commonalities, which make them work together much more than ending up dividing each other. But anyway, the Arab world cannot ignore the issue of ethnicity. It has to deal with all of its population, Arab or non-Arab, on an equal basis. But we need to provide a strong mandate to preserving the nation state. I would want to see significant changes in Arab practices of governance. There would probably also be changes in personalities according to what the Arab people want to do in that respect. What I would not like to see is any significant changes in borders, not because I'm obsessed with maps, but because it would only happen on the basis of ethnicity, and that, frankly, would be a very, very slippery slope. I ultimately believe that what is in common between Arab countries is much larger than what differences that exist between us. We tend to exaggerate, by the way. We tend to exaggerate in what's in common, and we tend to exaggerate in our differences. Many of you have been to many Arab meetings, and they always end up with identical positions. I don't, frankly, remember any meeting I've been at where the positions have been identical, but they've always been identical, and they've always been historic. I would have been much happier if we simply had a successful meeting where each one of us got 70% of what they wanted. It would be a much more realistic and much more practical process forward. If we don't do that, you're going to see further dissemination of Arab political weight, which will lead to further instability in the region. We need to change, again, we as Arabs, our security paradigm, more self-dependence, not complete self-dependence, but more self-dependence, more regional interdependence, and then interrelations with the international community. In some 4 words, Arabs need to act differently. Thank you very much.